this issue is obviously a controversial one, and I want to give some explanation of the larger reason permaculture has had a perhaps more positive focus on naturalising species. That's me down our local creek, which is a lot of the subject of this talk, and I'll explain a bit about that project. But I think permaculture focuses our efforts on design of sustainable land uses, but it's also based on the understanding that nature's a constant provider of abundance. Now, some of that abundance arises from relatively intact and ancient ecosystems, mostly husbanded by indigenous and traditional peoples around the world. Those things are now a tiny part of the global non-monetary economy and have mostly been destroyed and taken over by extractive capitalism in its various forms. But I suppose that comes mostly from places where human disturbance is not actually intact now, but has been scrambled, and if not eliminated, those ancient co-evolved ecosystems. So today, ecologists call these novel ecosystems where a range of indigenous and naturalised species participate in natural processes of colonisation, competition, symbiosis and succession. And they build soil and water holding capacity and provide ecosystem services and natural abundances. So this is somewhat of a radical idea in the conservation land management orthodoxy, at least in this country and some other countries that we pay attention to. So while permaculture focuses our efforts on the design of sustainable land uses, it's also based on that understanding that how do we make use of these eruptive abundances? And by using what others see as pests or taboos, we better find our place in nature. At the top left is some of the high country of New Zealand, which at European settlement was open, grassy, subalpine, well, not woodlands, but grasslands. Those grasslands have all changed by the action of sheep to mostly exotic species, and then progressively the colonisation of things like briar rose. But eruptive explosions of trees have also been a part of that, including Douglas fir, growing in rainfalls that the foresters thought were impossible for these trees to grow in. In fact, we should have known that these environments were open ecosystems ready for colonisation because of the work of the founder of the Men of the Trees, what's his name? Richardson Bar Baker was married into the run-holding family at Mount Cook Station, and he wrote several books over his life. One of them was about New Zealand, and he said that this high country, which New Zealanders regarded as a cold desert, was the spiritual home for trees for the whole world. He was of the Baha'i faith. New Zealanders thought he was a nutcase. Later, foresters had to sort of rethink, oh, trees grow very well here. And in fact, a huge amount of effort is put into poisoning these trees from helicopters. Whereas permaculture colleagues have managed and used these forests on a small basis. And so this conflict between a species which in New Zealand is regarded as an important timber tree, in fact even more so European larch, a higher quality timber again. So on the right is Moso bamboo, one of the largest of the temperate climate bamboos in the world, and it's more effective than forest trees at stabilising landslip prone mountain slopes in Japan, which like New Zealand is an eruptive, geologically young landscape. Now it's excellent construction material, fibre, food. It's central to Japanese culture, although it was only introduced to Japan 300 years ago. So the Japanese venerate rather than demonise this newcomer species, even though it's almost the archetype of an invasive species. When I've been places and seeing it come up through abandoned houses with these massive shoots. So in the same story, in our area, like many areas, kangaroos help groom the local golf course and reduce fire hazard, but also an abundance, so abundant that they become pests. So government regulations make our sensible use of this healthy and sustainable source of meat illegal. So it's easy to see how permaculture becomes political. And so you can see these abundances occur independent of whether something is long indigenous to a place or whether it's a newcomer. So this permaculture principle of integrate rather than segregate applies in many different ways, but certainly in our land use, after the promise of the early visionaries of land care, talking about integrating conservation and production, we then had it tend to separate in the 90s into conservations over there and productions over there. And yes, sometimes on the same farm, those agendas are considered and balanced by landholders, but they are conceptually different. So the great hope for agroforestry, farm forestry, has become a reductionist view back to industrial short rotation forestry. And then on the other hand, we've had planting of local indigenous species. Sometimes people saying, well, these are beautiful timber trees for the future, when those same species are actually abundant and not being managed. So for example, in our own area, some people might plant blackwood, Acacia melanoxylon, as a timber tree and maybe carefully prune it up, having sprayed the ground to sort of grow it in a few rows. Meanwhile, down the Otways, there are tens of thousands of hectares of regrowth blackwood, unmanaged or being swept aside to grow short rotation radiata pine plantations. So this separation is the very opposite of permaculture. So in this local creek course, the eucalypt, willow and poplar, this integration of old-timer and newcomer species, I believe provides functional ecosystem services and enhances biodiversity at low or no cost. So another permaculture principle of creatingly use and responding to change acknowledges that humans can and need to play God at times, but must also go with the flow of larger systemic forces that drive nature and society. So accelerating succession and evolution was an early expression of this more general principle that itself came from early awareness of observing nature's design processes. So in this example, in this photograph, a naturalised apple tree emerges from and subsequently suppresses the growth of blackberry. But the naturalisation of Northern Hemisphere blackberry, apple, and radiata pine from California in the background in the Southern Hemisphere is also generating new genetic biodiversity not previously seen in nature. There's very little research on this aspect, but I'm more than convinced there is more genetic diversity in the wilding pines of Australia, New Zealand, and Chile than there is in the threatened limited zone where radiata pine comes from on coastal California. Similarly, apples were brought from Central Asia, from Kazakhstan by the Romans to Western Europe, but they never really naturalised. They never really went wild. But when Europeans took apples to North America, they went wild. Johnny Appleseed was a real person, but it's the process of what nature did. And that then created a gold rush of horticulturalists 100 years or more later buying the patch of land that had this or that variety on it. The idea that all of these varieties were bred in research stations is actually wrong. Mostly they were found, either things found in the wild in the origins of their centres of diversity, like Kazakhstan for apples, or where they have gone wild. And in Southern Australia, over my lifetime, there has been this gradual but now accelerating explosion of new apple diversity. Of course, it might be 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 trees that might be of interest horticulturally, but it's a reflection of that new biodiversity, which my colleague Cale Snyderman, who's a paleoecologist, called these plants meta-indigenous because they actually don't occur anywhere else, or at least not so far. So I want to look at the origins of this positive view of naturalised species in permaculture, and firstly recognise that hunter-gatherer and gardening cultures, especially in Tasmania and the New Guinea Highlands, were a big influence on me and Mollison. And this dependence on natural and pulsing forms of abundance that hunter-gatherers and also gardening cultures work with what the flow is rather than trying to sort of more force the system to do something so much. And less effort to intervene and modify nature, and the idea that all life forms have moral status. There's not so much of a weed concept. The second influence was the 19th century botanists. My picture is of Baron von Müller, demonised as the idiot who introduced blackberries to Australia. He was actually, that occurred as a result of him virtually single-handedly identifying half the flora of Victoria and travelling through the country as the explosion of sheep moved into the indigenous landscapes and compacted the soils and ate down the native grasslands in ways that the native herbivores didn't, and resulted in the knifing out of the landscape with all these erosion channels long before anyone cut down any trees or even the gold rushes decimated regions like ours. And he was beseeching the government to halt the spread of sheep. The government wasn't interested in that, and he was in discussion with colleagues in Europe of what they could introduce that would spread down the drainage lines and stabilise this disaster. Now, maybe it was an unwise move. Maybe he didn't understand that the gold rush would result in the cost of labour rising to unprecedented heights in the world, and that all the people who, surely people can control blackberries. Well, apparently not. But I regard von Mueller as one of our great proto-ecologists. And obviously these economic botanists were doing very interesting stuff in the late 19th century. They were taking plants from one region to another, especially through the agency of Kew Gardens, because Europe had already experienced how the arrival of crops from North America had massively increased the productivity of European agriculture, especially with corn and potatoes. And then the movement of rubber trees from Brazil to Malaya, the movement of eucalypts to India, the recognition that there was this process called exotic vigor, where somehow some species actually grew better in the places they were taken to than where they came from. And in the 19th century at this time, there was a lot of concern that the explosion of power due to industrialization, due to non-renewable coal resources, would eventually run into problems, and that biological resources of wealth being explored through the science of economic botany was really important. Now that interest was on a collision course with the arrival of the super king resource of oil. And all of that interest in economic botany, so graphically depicted in Maiden's 1872 publication, Useful Plants of Australia, which was one of the prime references for Permaculture One. In fact, there wasn't any new books that exceeded that book. My facsimile edition, published in 1972, of that book was our primary reference. Shows there was that big gap. But there was another wave of interest in economic botany that happened in the 1930s, and that sort of also coincided with the rise of the first organic farming response to the impacts of the first phases of industrialisation of agriculture, including excessive cultivation. And that photo is of Lady Eve Balfour, one of those pioneers. This happened in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, especially associated with Steiner's work and biodynamics. Independently, unbeknown to all of us, was happening in Japan with the emergence of natural farming and the pioneers of that, which we later learned about through the work of Fukuoka. So these responses included a positive view of agricultural weeds as soil builders, green manure, cover crops, and habitat for beneficial insects, and being medicinal herbs. So in this way, permaculture can be seen as a branch off the tree of organic agriculture, and that lineage of positive view of weeds that drive us nuts is actually further back in the organic lineage. And the strong linkage to the ecological concept of pioneer plants, because in the early emergence of ecological science, although organics was coming out of practical soil and plant husbandry, there was this keen awareness that these are what ecologists call pioneer plants, those that first colonize and stabilize bare land. The next big influence was the work of Dana Meadows and others, authors, relatively young authors, of the Limits to Growth report of 1972, which I regard as the most important scientific report in history, far more important than any of the IPCC reports. And it was a top-down systems view rather than the reductionist aggregation of data up, which all the climate models seem to be. And it sort of introduced this enormous power of systems and design thinking, the limits of both resources and the limits of what the modelers called sinks, where all the pollution goes. And the oil crises of 1973 and 79 sort of supercharged the interest in these ideas. When oil went from $5 a barrel in 1972 to $40 a barrel in 1973 on the back of the Yom Kippur War, where the Saudis punished the West for supporting Israel and triggered the first major recession in Western affluent countries since the end of the Second World War. And of course, the second crisis, which was also a political one, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, permaculture is bracketed between those two crises. Permaculture One, published in 1978. Of course, there was a huge interest in all of the ideas of passive solar design, natural materials building, the first big further explosion in interest in organics, intentional communities, and of course the whole counterculture, which had some credibility as a result of things like the Reith Lecture by Bob Hawke when he was head of the ACTU, talking about actually supporting people to go out onto the land and be more self-reliant. That idea went down like a lead balloon, but and so the other aspects of the limits to growth were also ecotechnic design for an energy descent future. How would we adapt to this world of less? And the value of managed wild versus controlled cultivation. Because the less power humans have, the more they have to go back to having some small management involvement in what already exists, rather than saying we are going to sweep that away and create something else, because that all requires a lot of energy to do and to maintain, even if it can be done sustainably. The last influence, which I see in some ways as the greatest, is the least understood, the work of Howard Odum, who is really the conceptual godfather of permaculture. I never met him. My book, Principles and Pathways, is dedicated to his memory. His brother, Eugene Odum, was slightly better known, at least in this country, because he was the author of the text that so many people who studied ecology used at university, the fundamentals of ecology. But both of them were systems ecologists. And for me, that was tapping into the finding a lineage in ecology which didn't seem to be reductionist. Because already by 1974, I'd come to the conclusion that most of the academically trained ecologists I met, I thought they're bit people. They're botanists or zoologists. No disrespect to botanists and zoologists. But they saw things from the point of view of the bits, not so much the system. And it was actually, when I met Mollison, he didn't have a label ecologist on him. He was actually a senior tutor in the psychology faculty. And I thought, this guy thinks holistically. This is what I thought was ecological thinking. And then intellectually, I found this lineage of systems ecology, which had been so strong, but then faded for all sorts of reasons, which would be the subject of lots of PhDs to see why that happened. But this expanded systems ecology towards a theory of everything, and that using energy as a language and a currency to measure value, and recognizing that the maximum power principle in nature was effectively a fourth law of energy, and understanding the ecosystem services of self-maintaining nature. Okay, so in 1979, 1 year after Permaculture One was published, I travelled to New Zealand to work with Hākai Tāne, who I regard as my second mentor in permaculture. Hākai took me to Hawkeswood Forest, which I documented in this drawing in a brief essay, Impressions of New Zealand. going wild from original spaced planted park-like tree plantings of specimen trees, Hawkwood proved to me that nature was perhaps the most experienced designer of what 20 years later scientists came to call novel ecosystems. It was sort of a tall, wet sclerophyll eucalypt forest succeeding to a closed canopy, deciduous sort of rainforest, showing amazing functionality. It also had the highest population of wild pigs that the New Zealand Forest Service hunters had ever shot anywhere. So it was enormously productive in that sense. I remember Tane referencing some of Odum's more heretical land management ideas from his then recent teaching in New Zealand, a teaching visit. He was there at Lincoln University. For example, Odum suggested that the gorse and briar rose running wild over the sheep grazing hill country of the South Island was useful soil stabilising pioneers, and that direct seeding with suitable tree species could accelerate the succession to productive mixed forest, rather than burning or herbiciding, which led back to the same pioneer colonisation. So that one of the founding fathers of systems ecology had the same views we held on practical land management issues of hated and legally declared noxious weeds was heartening. So in 1984, Tane first used the term ecosynthesis to describe this rapid evolution of ecosystem function from self-organising contributions of indigenous and naturalising species. So this was more than a decade before the term novel ecosystems was used in the peer-reviewed scientific literature to recognise that novel assemblies of plants could perform ecosystem service functions, including biodiversity conservation, that most conservation biologists only thought was possible in long co-evolved indigenous ecosystems. So more recently, scientific journalism has recognised that perhaps 30% of the Earth's land area hosts some sort of novel ecosystem. And this has led to a substantial challenge to the ideology of nativism, which has dominated the field of conservation biology and land management over recent decades. Now, this nativism is especially strong in temperate climate nations of North America, Australia, New Zealand, where English-speaking settler cultures largely displaced indigenous peoples to create what William Crosby, ecological historian, called New Europes. So Europeans colonised India, but they didn't turn India into a new Europe. And lots of other places in Africa too. So those new Europes were supported by imported crops and livestock that were adapted to those temperate climates. So South Africa is an interesting case where that displacement to create a new Europe was less successful, primarily due to climate constraints, but where with the rest of the English-speaking world, reference to science has contributed to a strong adherence to nativist ideology. So inevitably, that orthodoxy in environmental thinking has been a strong influence on permaculture-inspired design, teaching, and land management, in spite of the fact that both the co-originators of permaculture were not convinced by its merits. So I acknowledge that permaculture is a very broad church and has many different perspectives. And in fact, I would say that Rosemary Morrow, who my great respect for her work is referenced by us as publishers, allowed her this huge freedom to expand her Earth User's Guide to Permaculture into the Earth Restorer's Guide to Permaculture. We just need to sell it to recover that faith in Rosemary's work. But Rosemary, perhaps living in the Blue Mountains in World Heritage areas where there's a strong concern about naturalising species, has a sort of a somewhat different perspective than me. So I want to acknowledge there are many different perspectives within permaculture on this. Another reason for embracing so-called invasives is the recognition that the war on weeds is unwinnable. Even in some of the most iconic global biodiversity hotspots, like the Galapagos Islands. On the other hand, some biodiversity hotspots, for example, the quartzite sand heathlands of the southwest of Western Australia, are so infertile that this has acted as a natural impediment to naturalisation by exotic species, especially in the heart of the conservation zone in the Fitzgerald River National Park. It helped that no one ever attempted to run sheep or cattle in that country, apart from dying of malnutrition due to all the trace element deficiencies. There was almost none of the vegetation is edible to animals. But it is one of the world's highest floristic biodiversity outside of the tropics. So the idea of a truce between humans motivated by ecosystem restoration imperatives and naturalising species leads to the recognition that the war on weeds more reflects the war on weeds of our agricultural ancestors than it is a sign of environmental or ecological enlightenment. And 10 years ago, this book captured both a personal story of one young person's journey in ecosystem restoration in North America, and also she documents the progressive corruption of conservation and land management by its dependence on Monsanto's Roundup herbicide as the default tool for killing naturalising species. Unfortunately, we've just sold out of our last copy of this book at Bellingen Readers and Writers Festival. But I was more than happy, in the absence of having written a book on the subject, to write the foreword to this book. So let's return to the local context to illustrate how some of these different ideas about earth restoration have played out over the last 3 decades on public land adjacent Meliodora. At Meliodora, over 35 years, 40 years now, we've demonstrated and documented sensible integrated use of indigenous, naturalised and planted species as part of permaculture self-reliance that regenerates the land while reducing ecological impact elsewhere. In other words, take responsibility for things here. And for our goats, rather than buying lucerne created with fossil fuel on some of our best land that can be food growing land, our goats go through droughts and good times fed by tree fodder, including willow species. Some of those same species that are being removed in our area. In consultancy, I've applied our learnings to projects on private and public land, but general adherence to nativism has limited the social and the legal license for these permaculture designed approaches to ecosystem restoration. I think this Harcourt Park is now a dog walking park, and they cut out a lot of the things. I was not talking about planting willows. I was just talking about managing willows rather than what passes for willow management, which is poisoning and removal. So these are environments like where we work, where large urban stormwater flows need more capable species to absorb the nutrients that are coming from those flows and to stabilise those environments. So the largest and longest running application of these approaches has been an informal, unfunded, unapproved, anarchistic, permaculture-inspired version of land care that's been operating here for all those decades, but without the paperwork and the poisons that characterise land care in Australia. As I said, all sponsored by Monsanto. So there's Meliodora up the head of this gully that we call Gulf Links Gully and joining down into Spring Creek, which you can see there has a full canopy of vegetation, which includes exotic trees and native trees. But we have a very accurate portrayal of Spring Creek from von Gerard in 1864, after it had been sluiced down to the bedrock. So the tunnels into the hillside showed the pursuit of gold in the shallow leads still under the volcanic caps, and the stone walls along the valley floor constraining the creek in flood, forcing water up and along contour water races used to sluice more soil further downstream. The goats you can see there at home on a rocky landscape of skeletal soils and few trees is emblematic of the result of Central Victorian region, which consists of the richest gold region in world history. So in the first half of the 20th century, self-reliant locals used these gullies as part of the common that were left barren by the gold mining to range their house cows, collect firewood, trap rabbits and collect blackberries. The story goes that housewives used to pick blackberries in the gullies and send them off to the IXL Henry Jones jam factory on the other side of Melbourne in the Dandenongs, where they received a premium for Daylesford blackberries because they had less water content than the higher rainfall blackberries from the Dandenongs. And with that, they would save the money for buying their children's school uniforms. A small example of a monetary economy, but most of what the use was part of a non-monetary economy. So abandonment of commons management in the 1960s with rising affluence and exclusion of livestock, exclusion of fire and people led to soil building under blackberry gorse and broom. And we have very good documentation that this soil building activity sort of really took off when people stopped those traditional uses. And it was the noxious weeds that were the primary thing that was doing that job. So after decades of abandonment, willows and other deciduous trees began to shade out these pioneers and create a more human-friendly, fire-safe and stormwater purifying canopy. But most areas were completely inaccessible. So in the late 1980s, we met Vern Howe, fourth generation local, who'd been planting trees on the creek a few years before. We teamed up to spend winter weekends down the gully, track making, release of trees already regenerating, and where we could, additional plantings. So our aims were to accelerate and diversify this natural succession process with a greater range of food, fodder and timber trees. Now, while I was a university educated, articulate, left-wing, long-haired greenie, Vern was a right-wing rural redneck who made up for his lack of my gift of the gab with an astute ability to read the landscape through his passion for hunting, fishing and forestry. He'd been a professional tree faller in the native forests most of his life. So as long as we didn't discuss Muslim immigration or the Gulf War, that was the first Gulf War, we found ourselves mostly in agreement on how to manage the gully. In any case, Vern said, try anything, it can hardly do any harm. So Vern and his work features in the film Reading Landscape with David Holmgren, the work of permaculture colleague late Dan Palmer. And there's the link to that website, readinglandscape.org. So our aesthetic appreciation of the environment grew in sync with our appreciation of the ecosystem services and new abundances. In parts close to home, we managed to create small spaces that reflect permaculture vision of fire-safe food and fodder forests that slow, spread and sink storm water flows to rehydrate landscape, all without using matches, herbicides or heavy machinery. Sometimes it's been one or two people keeping the tracks open. Episodically it's been energetic community working bees. We noted the diverse ways in which old-timer and newcomer species were fraternising and building long-term relationships. The gang parrots, that idea that, oh yes, these things eat this because their native foods aren't there. No, they prefer these things, these relationships. And this is actually the fastest form of ecosystem evolution, is through change in animal behaviour. That is the leading edge of ecosystem evolution. Of course, we're supposed to be an intelligent animal, so maybe that's our job. So Dr. Michael Wilson, Australia's foremost expert on willow ecology, was part of our crew when he did his PhD on willow ecology in Spring Creek in the late 90s. His work confirmed and exceeded our observations of sediment capture by willow root mats, showing that willows were capturing 40 times more sediment and 10 times more phosphorus than regrowth eucalypts growing in similar conditions. So these are streams sluiced down to bedrock, and then eucalypts naturally regenerating in the other creek that Spring Creek meets, and just because of chance, willows were the primary coloniser in Spring Creek, and that's that difference he found. So most of the build-up of the creek bed and the new alluvial flats was over the bedrock and stone piles left by the gold miners 150 years ago, and that appears to have occurred in the last 50 years since willow colonisation. Michael Wilson has since supervised half a dozen more PhDs on willows, most of them in central Victoria. He's one of the chief riparian ecosystem scientists at the Murray-Darling Basin Commission. Very quiet, self-effacing scientist, not a rat bag like me. And so those have confirmed our observations about these really remarkable trees, that this special nature of the willow root mat, we don't find any parallel in southern Australia. There are Melaleuca species in the top end that in the wet season have this sort of fibrous root mat that grows up over rocks and holds things together, develops this sort of like biological geotextile fabric. But in southern Australia, in spite of all of the other species which can contribute to these functions, there's nothing quite with the power of willows. So we've communicated our passion for these plants and places on permaculture design courses beginning in the early 1990s. And we've documented and communicated to others on tours, courses and the web, the extraordinary ecological and community services that these novel ecosystems provide. So this profile drawn by Brenda Quinlan for the Retro Suburbia chapter Beyond the Boundaries. Retro Suburbia, of course, is mostly focused on what people can do on their private lots, but there's a little exploration of these issues. So that's a a cross-section showing the deciduous trees without leaves and the old miners' walls, now buried in these new alluvial flats, which are gradually rebuilding the floor of the creek. So the Spring Creek page on the Holmgren design website includes more photos, reports and news. We've been in the process of completely updating that, but we haven't launched it yet. My partner in these matters, Beck Lowe, has been on the case. But we've also defended areas from destruction disguised as land care by governments and catchment authorities that it can continue to ignore the science. So it was actually the destruction of heritage-listed creek bank walls built by the gold miners from that era that was the only statutory basis for stopping having a 20-tonne excavator in the creek in peak spring flows. I did get threatened by the operator of this excavator to get the fuck out of here as I took that photo. And he is probably one of the most competent machine operators in our region, but he's also probably the greatest environmental vandal who is licensed to do this work. And he thinks, I think it's a great joke that the greenies get him to get in and tear out creeks that in a state forest, if you did this, that would be the end of you. You know, no state forests where logging still occurs would be allowed to do something like that. It doesn't mean to say it doesn't happen occasionally, but on the scale of what this was done, there's no way the contractors would be out. So an injunction by Heritage Victoria forced the catchment authorities to stop its work. So this beautiful section of the creek was saved, and it's continuing to mature, having weathered 2 record-breaking droughts and 2 so-called 1 in 500-year flood events. Yeah. So this photo was taken as the floodwaters receded last spring, no, the spring before, revealing new deposition, building back the soil lost in the gold era. It's a bit hard to see it there under the water, but this is oh, there it is. There's, so this is where the water is slowing down and spread out, forming a braided process. So I got that, that's a video. And further down where they did do the willow poisoning below this bridge, I don't know how many thousand cubic metres of bank has gone, and that is now from any basic riparian ecology process, that is a degraded stream course. But it's also interesting that up above that bridge is where the willows have been continued to deposit. But now since this down cutting, that down cutting is going through under the bridge and is actually undermining the bridge foundations, which is pretty interesting. So yeah, that's 200 metres further downstream from where that other photo was taken. So there were efforts at native revegetation here. They died or were ineffective or got eaten by the wallabies. Yeah, there wasn't really a success in changing that. So upstream of Breakneck Gorge in the previously denuded areas, the willows, sycamore, maple, elderberry and native blackwood are again just beginning to shade out the brambles, although there's been no regeneration from seed of any of the semi-mature native eucalypts on the upper slopes. So all of this area had mature willow, blackwood and sycamore trees, and then all of those were herbicided. Obviously where they could, they left the blackwoods, and then this regrowth of trees is now just starting that process again to shade out the blackberries. So as the millennial drought intensified in 2005, we began using goats to further reduce the fire hazard and gain a yield from the abundant biomass. We constructed small leaky weirs to capture nutrients containing sediment and retain stream corridor hydration through long dry summers to better reduce the threats from wildfire. This is all capturing urban stormwater from our small town catchment. And in 2009, all our preparations over decades to stay and defend Melliodora against the worst of firestorms allowed us to consider forward defence of our work through a lesser fire emergency where Spring Creek was the front line in what turned out to be a massive marshalling of state resources to defend the town. The fire was stopped at the edge of the creek corridor. We're incredibly grateful for the full force of technological firepower, the good luck of benign weather, and the modest resilience already demonstrated by novel nature for a world that some see as accelerating climate chaos. So there's many lessons to digest from the experience to further empower more informal occupation and management of our commons. But the broader lessons I want to convey is there's lots of opportunities to re-inhabit the commons without permission or support. And over time, this rehabilitation can provide a base for wider community support and even functional policy response. But we need to accept that others in our community and in authority will not necessarily see value and may strongly subvert or even block positive action. And we need to be ready to take advantage of changed circumstances, especially due to natural forces and dramatic exercises of state power, and continue to build stronger households and neighbourhoods that are able to stand their ground with or without benign and functional state power. So this is the Vernhal Arboretum, as we call it, during the first of those 1 in 500 year flood events in 2011. Today, those Californian redwoods in the photo are up to 1 metre diameter and 35 metres tall. The power of nature to heal and create renewed abundance is one of the brightest stars in a very dark night of challenge and change we face. Learning to work with rather than against nature in the wider commons, especially around settlements and towns, is one of the great opportunities to applying permaculture principles beyond the garden scale. And I'll leave you with that, and happy to take questions and comments.